I grew up in church, and like many young people, I didn't mind it much when I was a kid. But when I became a teenager, I became kind of indifferent toward church. But I had very devout parents, and as long as I lived under their roof, I was going to church. I'd literally have to have one foot in the grave to get out of it. So, growing up, church attendance for me was not an option. And while I didn't particularly enjoy church, I did love seeing the ladies in their Sunday go-to-meeting outfits. Today, it seems that society has become extremely informal. And maybe we need something like church to, if nothing else, get people to dress up again. I used to think the women with their makeup, beautiful outfits, refined fabrics, skirts, blouses, dresses, heels and hose were awesome. Between seeing the women all dressed up and getting to talk to girls my age in the teen study class, I was able to deal with the long prayers, long sermons, and hours of boring, pointless ritual. Mrs. Lee, the wife of one of the church's aldermen, led the study group. Her eldest daughter, Samantha, who everyone called Sam, was also in the group with her two younger sisters, Janice and Jessica. Sam was my age and I had been crushing on her for weeks. I also really liked Mrs. Lee, who was every bit as beautiful as her daughters. Now, as I said, Mrs. Lee was beautiful, but at this point, I didn't think of her quite like I thought of Sam. I liked Mrs. Lee because she seemed to value my thoughts, encouraged my participation, and had a knack of drawing me out. I guess I was also her teacher's pet, as she would regularly ask me to do extra things to get the class ready, like make copies of reading materials, set up the tables, unstack and place the chairs, get out the dry erase board, stuff like that. It was the same thing for after the class, but putting stuff away. Often, after class, she would ask what I thought about the discussions and sometimes what topics we'd covered the following week. I was more than happy to oblige her. Like I said, she was every bit as attractive as Sam. Long brown hair, full lips on a mouth quick to smile, cute nose, freckles, though neither Sam or her younger sisters had nearly as many of those. Mrs. Lee was easy for me to talk to, always encouraging me to speak my mind, and gave me suggestions for reading. She'd laugh if I said something funny. Even better, she would usually reward me with a hug, pressing her ampleness into me, occasionally giving me a peck on the cheek. Sometimes, and with what seemed like increasing frequency over the last several Sundays, it was like she would wait until I was sitting down so she could give me a kiss on the forehead. That I really enjoyed because then her ampleness was, literally, in my face. Anyways, when I would have my sessions at night, or in the morning, or in the shower, or when I could. After all, I was a teenage boy in high school with raging hormones and would have a session at every opportunity. I would often fantasize about Sam, but at times Mrs. Lee would appear in my imagination, with her hourglass figure and amplitude that I would sneak a look at every chance I got. Sometimes I'd think about the two of them together and boom, I'd be on the mountain top before I knew it. So, one particular Sunday, the teen group topic was sex and sex morality. I noticed Sam's dress was cut above her knees, which was a little out of the ordinary, but very understandable as it was a warm, late spring day. Sundays like that called for higher cuts, shorter sleeves and open collars for the women. For us boys it meant short sleeves and no vests under our suit jackets. And many of us wore regular long ties so that we could undo the top button of our dress shirts. What really caught my eye was that Mrs. Lee's top was open at the top two buttons and her amplitude was, well, let's just say I had to force myself to look directly at her face when she called on me. I was grasping at straws to find scriptures to help me win my argument that sex was a gift from God, and that it wasn't evil or immoral. But we have turned something beautiful into something sinful. She knew I was going hard with my argument because as any hormone-raging teenage boy, All I could do every day and every hour was think about sex. And I don't know if it was me or the subject matter, but every now and then she would smile and lean forward slightly, as if to dare me to look at her amplage. Now, it was probably my imagination, but it seemed like she had been doing the most here recently to attract my attention over the last few weeks. And did I tell you who was sitting on the other side of me? Yep, you guessed it. Sam. On this warm late spring day, when a young man like me was experiencing peak raging hormones, I was sitting at the large conference table, sandwiched between Mrs. Lee and her eldest daughter. For me, this scenario was an extremely satisfying, but made it extremely difficult for me to concentrate on anything I was supposed to be concentrating on in Sunday school class. And because my mind was on the flesh and not the spirit, it seemed like Sam was making more accidental physical contact, like she would touch my arm or brush her leg against mine. But because it wasn't anything overt or obvious, I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. Every now and then Connor, who was long-winded and tended to drift off topic, would take the class way off topic and give us all a good chuckle. It may have been because he didn't seem to have much scriptural support for his points. He didn't like me much, but that's okay because I didn't like him either. But I'll admit that I did enjoy messing with him. It never took much. I'd quote a verse which contradicted him, ask him to cite a relevant passage, or call him out when he was just full of it. Anyway, as the class continued, I noted that the Old Testament is rife with Abraham and his half-sister, wife Sarah, Jacob and both his wives, cousins Rebekah and Leah, Lot and his daughters, and Noah's family post-flood are the easy standout. Not only that, but the enslavement of women to be used as concubines without the bother of marrying them, of women having their husbands use their handmaidens as sexual surrogates was something we don't talk much about. At the end, I argued that much of what we currently accept as sexual morality isn't based in the Bible, but on ever-changing social expectations. By the time the class was over, between the subject matter, Sam and Mrs. Lee, I was sporting a obvious one. I was deliberately slow in gathering up my stuff. Bible, notebook, pencil, and repacking my vinyl portfolio as I tried to get myself under control. The other kids had already cleared out. As usual, Mrs. Lee asked me if I would stay and help put things away. Of course, I said yes, but I didn't move right then as I hoped she would turn her back to me long enough for me to readjust myself. She didn't. Instead, she asked,
"You like Sam, don't you, Jackson? I mean as more than just a friend."
I felt my face heat up as I answered, "Yeah, well, she's really cute, and she's smart and fun and stuff."
"So why haven't you asked her out?"
I literally couldn't get a word out.
"You should hear her at home. She talks about you all the time. I think she has a crush on you. But I can't blame her. You're a very handsome young man, Jackson, and very bright. And I also bet that you are smart enough to be discreet and keep some things to yourself."
As she was saying this, she had moved close to me and leaned over, allowing a clear look down her blouse. Her undergarment was made of a shiny black material, cut low so her amplage was plainly visible. Her hand was resting on my thigh.
"I've noticed how you look at me when you think no one sees you,"
she whispered into my ear as she squeezed me. Her face was inches from mine. She squeezed me again and leaned in. Now I had no idea what I was doing. But thank the Lord that Mrs. Lee did. I felt her other hand on the back of my head. She leaned in for another one, and another long one. Next thing I knew, we were off to the races. We were headed to the mountaintop. My heart was racing. She complimented me and told me that I have some very nice hiking equipment. As we went up the mountaintop, I thought to myself that this is unreal. It's the kind of experience I daydream about all the time. It's the kind of experience that I fantasize about during my private stress-relieving sessions. It's the kind of experience that every young man has. Whether he's thinking about going to the mountaintop with a teacher, counselor, or in my case the Sunday school teacher, all young men have some type of fantasy about an older woman, and mine's is coming true. Mrs. Lee said.
Do you know why I'm doing this, Jackson?
I shook my head no. I was too focused on our journey to talk. She said,
I got married when I was 17, and I've gone to the mountaintop exactly 3 times in my life. But I'm done being a faithful, dutiful wife to a man who doesn't want to touch me, who is never at home, and has been mountain-topping around on me for years.
she growled.
I know the effect I have on you. I can't remember when the last time a man made me feel I was an attractive woman, a man who seems to enjoy talking with me as much as I enjoy talking with him, and a man who makes me feel attractive just by how he looks at me. A man like you, Jackson. If you're willing, if you want me, you can have me. Play ball and I'll even help you become Sam's boyfriend. Okay, Jackson.
I was so keyed up I could hardly nod my head, let alone form my lips to say something that sounded like a yes. I barely managed to keep it together. We climbed, and we climbed, and we climbed until finally we arrived. We were at the mountaintop. I think she was surprised at how I reacted when I got there. Everything was spinning. I was depleted. Finally, Mrs. Lee said,
Congratulations, you're my first. I never knew a man could expend so much energy after arriving at the top of the mountain. And I certainly didn't know a man could still have energy afterwards. I can't let you walk around like this. Someone may notice. She unfastened her top and said, I think we have time for one more round, and I want to feel that here. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, sure I guess. Still reeling from the first experience. Mrs. Lee took my hands and away we went. This time, Mrs. Lee made it to the mountaintop before I did, but I wasn't far behind. We rested for a moment and then Mrs. Lee said,
Jackson, we can do this again as long as you don't tell anyone.
I said, yeah, Mrs. Lee, I won't say anything to anyone. Why would I? I don't want to get into any trouble, and I sure would like to do more of this. What else was I going to say? Besides, it was the truth. Mrs. Lee stood up and began to fix her clothing. She nodded to a box of tissues and said,
You better use those to clean up a bit and get sipped up. The service will start soon, so you'll need to hurry and get the chairs stacked up so you won't be late.
She eyed me critically.
Are you sure you can keep quiet, and would you like to do more of this, Jackson?
Yes, Mom. I definitely want to do more of this, Mrs. Lee, and I absolutely don't want any trouble, which is the only thing that saying anything to anyone is going to do. But
No buts. Jackson, I know you have questions, but now is not the time or the place.
Mrs. Lee interrupted.
Just give me your promise to stay quiet and be discreet. I promise we'll talk about it later.
Yes, Mrs. Lee. You have my promise I'll keep my mouth shut and do my best to make sure this all stays on the down low. She smiled at me.
Good boy. Tell your folks I've offered you a job doing yard work and chores after school and on weekends. I've already discussed it with them and Mr. Lee. When Sam or either of her sisters are around, you'll be working. But when they aren't, and I'll see to it that they're not as much as I can, you'll still be working, just with less clothing. That way you'll have some spending money to take Sam out on dates. Would that be okay?
Yes, Mrs. Lee, was my enthusiastic reply.